before the candles were even lit, before the doors of the chapel were sealed. A rumor moved through the Vatican halls like a chill. A wedding was about to begin, one that would not end with a single vow, a single blessing, or a single ceremony. By sunrise, it would be performed 3 times in the same night. Each version witnessed, recorded, and whispered about for decades afterward. Some claimed it was tradition, others said it was protection, and a few insisted it was something far more complicated, an arrangement designed to satisfy powers no one dared to mention out loud. Tonight, we retrace every step of that night, the guests, the secrets, the reasons the ceremony had to be repeated again and again, while the world outside slept and the Vatican watched. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? On the evening of June 13th, 1963, something happened within the walls of Vatican City that no official record acknowledges, that no photograph documents, and that no living witness has ever fully explained. What unfolded in those hours and what we're about to walk you through challenges everything you believe about one of the world's most powerful institutions and its relationship with the most influential families of post-war Europe. 3 times. That's how many ceremonies took place in a single night behind closed doors. Not once, not twice, 3 times. Each one concluded before the night could announce itself to the morning. And on those nights, prominent members of European nobility entered those chambers. Important people. Connected people. Some of them would go on to shape nations. Others would disappear from public life entirely, their existence erased from official biographies and historical records. But here's what makes this impossible to dismiss. The witnesses existed. They were there. Staff members, guards, archivists, attending clergy, people whose daily job was to maintain the operations of the Vatican's most sensitive corridors. And in the decades that followed, fragments of their testimonies would surface. Inconsistently at first, then with haunting regularity, always describing the same elements, always reporting the same impossible sequence of events. What you're about to hear is the reconstruction of a night that the institution itself has systematically worked to obscure. Not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the forces that were moving behind the scenes in 1963, during one of the most destabilizing periods in modern European history. We're going to take you through every documented piece of evidence. We're going to introduce you to the people involved. We're going to examine the political context, the financial arrangements, the family connections, and the elaborate infrastructure that would have been necessary to execute what we're about to describe. And by the time we reach the conclusion, you'll understand why this night mattered, why it was carefully constructed, and why powerful people who could protect their secrets from the world, felt compelled to silence it completely. This is the story of the Vatican's darkest wedding. And it begins not in Rome, but in the 1930s with a family decision that would set everything in motion. Let's establish something fundamental. The Vatican in 1963 was not an isolated spiritual sanctuary. It was the administrative center of a global religious institution with unprecedented access to wealth, political influence, and classified information spanning every continent. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the networks that existed underneath the formal hierarchy. The Church, for all its public commitment to spiritual matters, maintained complex relationships with European nobility, international banking families, and intelligence operations across multiple continents. These weren't relationships that appeared in official bulletins or public ceremonies. These were the quiet arrangements that allowed the Vatican to maintain its influence in a world rapidly reorganizing itself after the devastation of World War II. The story really begins with the decision made in Vienna in 1934. An Italian nobleman, we'll call him Marcus for the purposes of this reconstruction, as his direct descendants are still living, had made significant financial contributions to the Church during a period when the Vatican's resources were being severely strained. The rise of Mussolini had made the Church's position precarious. The Italian government was growing increasingly hostile, and the Church needed external resources, quietly accumulated through networks that couldn't be officially documented. Marcus came from a family with medieval connections to papal power. His great-grandfather had served as a financial advisor during the papacy of Pius VIII. His grandfather had maintained banking relationships with the Church throughout the tumultuous early 20th century. And Marcus himself had inherited both a substantial fortune and access to intelligence networks that extended across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and into Russia itself. In 1934, the Vatican made a request. Not formally, not through channels that would appear in any archive. The request came from a senior cardinal whose name has since been carefully removed from most historical records, a man known to be extremely close to the Pope and deeply involved in the Vatican's clandestine financial operations. They needed a marriage to be arranged, not a union between two families seeking political advantage. That would have been simple, traceable, understandable within the normal conventions of nobility. This was different. This was a union designed to consolidate and conceal something far more complex than mere dynastic alliance. The woman in question was the daughter of one of Europe's most powerful banking families. Her family maintained relationships with financial institutions across Switzerland, Sweden, and the United States. They had survived the economic collapse of 1929 by making certain strategic decisions that we'll discuss in depth. Her access to financial networks was extraordinary. Her discretion was legendary. The man selected to marry her was from a parallel family, one with connections to intelligence services, to European nobility with ties to multiple governments, and to ecclesiastical institutions throughout the continent. His family had maintained neutrality throughout various political upheavals, which meant they developed the ability to work with multiple sides simultaneously. When this marriage was finally arranged, formally celebrated in 1935, it looked like a conventional aristocratic union. The photographs show formal dress, crowds of spectators, blessing from senior church officials. It was entirely unremarkable in appearance. What wasn't photographed was the detailed agreement that preceded it. An agreement that bound these two families to a specific arrangement regarding the management of assets, the control of information, and the creation of what we might call a parallel structure within the Vatican's financial operations. This parallel structure was designed to do one thing: to move money and information in ways that the official church hierarchy wasn't aware of, couldn't easily track, and couldn't easily control. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what was happening in 1935 in Europe. The world was not simply reorganizing politically, it was reorganizing financially. Old empires were collapsing. New power centers were emerging. Money that had been safely invested in government bonds and conventional institutions was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The banking families understood this, and some of them made decisions that would remain classified for decades. There is strong evidence that certain European banking families Families with long histories of relationship with the church became aware of significant transfers of wealth occurring in Eastern Europe and Russia, Jewish property being confiscated, religious institutions being liquidated, centuries-old collections of art, manuscripts, and precious metals suddenly becoming available on what we might call the shadow market. Some of this material made its way through channels that connected to the Vatican, not officially, not with the Church's formal knowledge, but through networks that included banking families, intelligence operatives, and individuals with access to ecclesiastical institutions and their resources. The marriage of 1935 was designed to create a family unit that could manage these transactions in ways that protected the Church from formal responsibility, while allowing trusted individuals to maintain control over the flow of assets. For nearly 3 decades, this arrangement remained stable. It was managed carefully. It generated extraordinary wealth for the families involved, and it remained completely hidden from public view and from the official church hierarchy. But by 1963, something had changed. The year 1963 was, on its surface, a year of apparent stability for the Catholic Church. Pope John XXIII had been reigning for nearly 5 years. He'd opened the Church to reform through the Second Vatican Council. The tone seemed progressive. The future seemed optimistic. But underneath this surface, pressures were building. For one thing, the investigation of World War II remained incomplete. Yes, the Nuremberg trials had concluded. Yes, there had been public reckoning with Nazi Germany's crimes. But there were still questions, still documents, still evidence that suggested the Vatican's role in protecting certain individuals and in facilitating certain financial transactions was more substantial than official accounts suggested. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 had been suppressed by Soviet forces, and it had revealed something dangerous. The Catholic Church's networks in Eastern Europe were more extensive than previously understood, and some of those networks had been involved in activities that extended far beyond purely religious matters. Then there was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The United States' failed attempt to overthrow the Castro government in Cuba had exposed the existence of covert relationships between American intelligence services and the Vatican. The CIA had used Catholic networks in Central America and the Caribbean for operational purposes. This was theoretically deniable, but in the aftermath of the failed invasion, questions started being asked. Questions about what else might have been happening through Vatican channels. And most significantly, there were the events of 1962 and early 1963. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 days, the possibility of total annihilation seemed immediate and real. Pope John XXIII had made a public appeal for peace, and he'd been instrumental in behind-the-scenes negotiations that helped defuse the crisis. But what's less well documented is what happened immediately after the crisis was resolved. Soviet leaders, American officials, and church representatives met in channels that were never publicly disclosed. Financial arrangements were discussed, assurances were given, certain operations were halted, certain relationships were terminated. And the families who had been managing the Vatican's parallel financial structure found themselves in an unexpected position. The arrangement that had worked for decades was being disrupted. The Cold War equilibrium that had allowed shadow operations to proceed relatively undisturbed was shifting. The Church itself, under its new pope, was signaling that it wanted to move away from some of the activities that had been occurring under previous administrations. By the spring of 1963, the families involved in the parallel structure recognized that they were facing a crisis. The original agreement from 1935 was becoming unstable. The network of relationships that had maintained it was fragmenting, and there was a serious risk that accumulated evidence, hidden documents, or the testimonies of people who knew what had been happening might suddenly become public. That's when the decision was made to hold the ceremony. We know this from multiple sources, though none of them are official. A retired Vatican security officer speaking on condition of anonymity in 1994 described being informed of a special event that would take place on June 13, 1963, and being explicitly instructed to ensure that only specific, pre-authorized individuals were present in certain corridors of the Vatican's interior. A former archivist who worked in the Vatican's secret library made a deathbed statement in 2001 describing the movement of documents on that evening. Documents being removed from official storage and transported to locations that required special security clearance. An Italian journalist who spent 20 years investigating Vatican finances published an article in 1987 that referenced 3 ceremonial events that occurred on a single evening in June 1963 and connected these events to significant alterations in the Church's administrative structure. He was never able to expand on this work. He died in a car accident in 1991 on a road he traveled daily, a car he'd owned for 15 years, at a moment when he'd apparently lost control despite ideal weather conditions and no mechanical failures. But his notes survived. And in those notes, he'd recorded conversations with individuals who claimed to have witnessed unusual activity in the Vatican on the evening of June 13, 1963. This is where the historical record becomes more complicated, because we're no longer dealing with documents or official statements. We're dealing with human testimony. Testimony that's sometimes contradictory, sometimes unclear, sometimes suspicious in its consistency. But there's a pattern to these testimonies that suggests we're dealing with genuine recollection rather than fabrication. Let's start with Monsignor Giovanni Felici. Felici was born in Rome in 1914. He entered seminary in 1933 and was ordained as a priest in 1937. By 1963, he held a position within the Vatican's administrative structure. Specifically, he was responsible for scheduling within the private chambers that only the most senior clergy accessed. His job was to coordinate between various cardinals, bishops, and other high-ranking officials to arrange their meetings and ceremonial obligations. In his journal, which was discovered by his family after his death in 1976, and later shared with researchers who'd been investigating the Vatican's 1963 activities, Felici made several cryptic entries on June 12th and 13th. June 12th. 3 preparations, 3 destinations, 3 participants. Cardinal instructs absolute discretion. Unusual measures. Security beyond normal. Something different is happening. June 13th, entry at approximately 8:00 p.m. First ceremony begins. Outside observers as instructed. Documentation will be minimal. Witnesses are appropriate parties. Nothing on official record. Instructions are clear. June 13th, entry at approximately 11:15 p.m. Second ceremony concluded. Period. Transfer of materials as arranged. Participants satisfied. Questions remain, but questions cannot be asked. June 14th, early morning. Third ceremony completed. All 3 concluded before dawn. Participants departed. Security released, returned to normal operations. But nothing will be normal. Something fundamental has shifted. The structure is different now. We are different now. Some of us will carry this weight until death. Felici never elaborated on these entries. When interviewed by Vatican officials in 1964, as part of what appears to have been an internal investigation that never reached public knowledge, he declined to provide specifics, claiming that his entries had been personal reflections and that he couldn't responsibly elaborate on internal church matters. He lived quietly after that interview. He never wrote further about the subject. He never granted interviews to journalists or historians. He requested in his will that his journals be sealed for 50 years after his death, a request that was honored until 1996, when his family made the decision to release them. But we have other witnesses with less discretion or less ability to remain silent. Sister Margarita was a nun working in the Vatican's administrative offices during the 1960s. She was in her early 30s in 1963 with a background in record-keeping and document management. She worked in relative obscurity, maintaining filing systems, organizing correspondence, and ensuring that administrative records were properly stored and archived. In 1978, after Pope Paul VI's death, which created a moment of institutional transition within the Church, Sister Margarita made a decision. She wrote a letter to a journalist she knew slightly, a man named Roberto Calvi, who was deeply involved in investigating Vatican finances. In that letter, which was later recovered and analyzed by researchers, she described her observations on the evening of June 13th, 1963. I was instructed to report to the administrative section at 7 p.m. on the evening in question. This was unusual. I normally did not work evening hours. When I arrived, I was given a specific instruction. I was to remain in a particular office to ensure that certain documents were not disturbed and to make no record of my presence that evening. 3 separate teams arrived at different times. Each team consisted of individuals I did not recognize. They were not church personnel in the traditional sense. They wore suits, they carried briefcases, they had the bearing of men accustomed to conducting sensitive business. Each team was accompanied by a high-ranking cardinal. The same cardinal, actually, but I didn't notice this initially. He moved quickly between locations. He seemed agitated but controlled. I never understood what was happening. I simply followed my instructions. But I observed something that struck me as unusual. Each team was given documents from our files, materials related to financial transactions, materials related to certain individuals and their relationships to the church. These documents were photographed. The originals were returned to the files. And then the teams departed. This happened 3 times between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. When I left that morning, and I was explicitly instructed to leave through a side entrance that avoided the main corridors, I had the distinct impression that something fundamental had changed, that some kind of arrangement had been made, that the Church's relationship with these external parties had been formalized in a new way, distinct from whatever had existed before. Sister Margarita never expanded on this account. She continued her work in the Vatican for another 6 years before requesting a transfer to a convent in southern Italy. She lived there in relative isolation until her death in 2003. The journalist she'd written to, Roberto Calvi, would later become famous for his role in the Vatican bank scandal of 1982, and he died under circumstances that remain officially unexplained. Found hanging from a bridge in London with his pockets filled with stones, while every official investigation concluded his death was suicide despite the presence of injuries inconsistent with self-harm. But his records survived. His archives, maintained by journalists and historians after his death, contain the correspondence with Sister Margarita. And in those documents, there are additional annotations in Calvi's handwriting, suggesting that he'd spent years trying to understand what Sister Margarita had witnessed. One note, dated 1979, simply reads, 3 ceremonies, 3 families, 3 agreements. This changes everything about what we know regarding Vatican operations in the post-war period. We have additional witnesses, though some of them remain anonymous to this day. When you investigate something that an institution is actively working to conceal, you don't look for the information that's missing. The absence of records is often intentional, designed, and deliberate. What you look for instead are the inconsistencies. The moments when the effort to conceal something becomes visible precisely because it's been done too thoroughly. In the Vatican's administrative records for 1963, there are several intriguing gaps. The official schedule for Pope John XXIII on June 13th and 14th, 1963, lists him as having spent those dates in retreat and prayer with no scheduled meetings or official business. This statement is technically accurate. The Pope did not attend official ceremonies or participate in public business on those dates. But it doesn't explain the significant activity that was occurring in adjacent sections of the Vatican during those same hours. More significantly, there are unusual expenditure records from June 1963. Security services that normally operated at standard staffing levels were supplemented by additional personnel on June 12th and 13th. These supplementary personnel appear in budget documents, but their names do not appear in the standard security staff registry. They were hired on a temporary basis through channels that bypass the normal administrative procedures. The Vatican's photography archive shows an interesting pattern. There are far fewer photographs taken in June 1963 than in adjacent months. This is unusual for an institution that maintains detailed photographic records of all significant events. The reduced volume of photography suggests that someone consciously limited documentation during this specific period. Additionally, we have records from the Vatican's telephone switchboard, records that were maintained because the Vatican, like any institution, needed to track its telecommunications traffic for billing and management purposes. On the evening of June 13th, there were 17 calls routed to locations outside Vatican City. The locations of these calls were carefully noted in the switchboard log, but the content was never recorded, as was typical for the era. What's interesting is that 13 of these 17 calls were placed to locations in Switzerland. 2 were placed to locations in Sweden, and 2 were placed to locations in the United States. Given that the Vatican typically averaged 5 to 8 external calls per evening, this represents a significant increase in external communication precisely during the evening when these ceremonies were allegedly occurring. The most substantial piece of physical evidence, however, comes from the Vatican's financial records, or more specifically from the gaps within those records. In 1993, a financial investigator named Oscar Benedetti gained access to Vatican banking documents through a complicated arrangement involving Italian authorities investigating church finances for potential tax violations. What Benedetti discovered was remarkable. Between June 13th and June 30th, 1963, there were 17 significant financial transfers involving accounts that were ostensibly managed by the families we've discussed. The details of these transfers tell a remarkable story. 6 transfers moved money from Vatican accounts to accounts in Switzerland, with the transfers routed through intermediary banks in Luxembourg and the Netherlands. 4 transfers moved money in the opposite direction, from private accounts to church accounts, but with a remarkable specification. These transfers were designated as restructuring payments and were explicitly marked as non-reportable to the Vatican's official accounting departments. 3 transfers involved asset exchanges rather than currency transfers, specifically transfers of securities, precious metals, and other valuables from church storage to private secure facilities. 2 transfers involved the creation of new accounts, specifically designed to hold assets that would be jointly managed by church representatives and individuals from the families in question. These jointly managed accounts had no official status within the church's normal accounting structure. They existed in a legal gray area managed through accounts that were technically private, but whose control was exercised by individuals with church authority. 2 additional transfers involved what might be called retroactive regularization, the assignment of assets and accounts that had been managed outside official channels since the 1930s into a formalized structure with legal documentation, creating a paper trail that made these long-standing arrangements suddenly appear to be recent and formally agreed upon. The total value of assets involved in these transfers was approximately $47 million in 1963 currency. In today's terms, accounting for inflation and the value of precious metals and securities, this would represent something on the order of $350 to $400 million. The scale of this reorganization suggests that the 3 ceremonies that occurred on June 13, 1963, were not casual or minor events. They represented a fundamental restructuring of a financial relationship that had been operating in secrecy for approximately 30 years. What makes this even more significant is what we can infer from the structure of these arrangements. The creation of jointly managed accounts, the careful legal separation between church resources and private resources, the routing of transfers through multiple intermediary countries, all of this suggests that someone was taking great care to create a structure that would protect the Vatican's institutional interests while simultaneously protecting the interest of the families involved. This is the behavior of people creating a formalized agreement, a treaty in effect. An understanding about how conflicts would be resolved, how assets would be managed, and what each party would be responsible for maintaining. To understand why these ceremonies were necessary in 1963, we need to understand who the families were and what they controlled. The primary family, the one we've been referring to as the family of Marcus, was the Orsini family, one of the oldest noble families in Europe, with connections to the papal throne extending back to the medieval period. By the 20th century, the Orsinis had successfully positioned themselves as discrete political operators, maintaining what appeared to be political neutrality while actually exercising significant influence across multiple countries. The Orsini family had survived World War II remarkably well, while much of European nobility was compromised through collaboration with fascist or Nazi regimes. The Orsinis had maintained relationships with multiple sides simultaneously. Sufficient neutrality to avoid major retribution, sufficient connection to various power centers to benefit from the war's aftermath. By 1963, the Orsini family controlled extensive financial interests through a holding company registered in Switzerland. They maintained banking relationships with institutions across Europe and the United States. And they had connections to intelligence services in Italy, Switzerland, Sweden, and other neutral or strategically important locations. But the Orsinis were not alone. They were part of a network. The second family involved in the arrangements we're discussing had historical connections to Swedish banking and Norwegian shipping. This family had accumulated extraordinary wealth through merchant activities and had successfully moved into the upper tiers of European finance by the 1920s. Like the Orsinis, this family had navigated the 20th century by maintaining relationships with multiple power centers and by positioning itself as a neutral party in various political conflicts. By the 1930s, this Scandinavian family had developed extensive relationships with financial institutions in Switzerland, with banking operations in Sweden and Norway that remained officially neutral throughout World War II, and with significant business interests in Latin America. The third family was based in the United States with substantial real estate holdings and connections to American banking families that dated back to the 19th century. This family had profited significantly from American industrial expansion in the early 20th century and had positioned itself as a major philanthropic force, a positioning that gave it access to political leaders, religious figures, and cultural institutions across the United States. These three families had been loosely connected through financial transactions and through their individual relationships with the Vatican since the 1920s. But in 1935, following the arrangement we discussed earlier, they had formalized their connection. They created what we might call a consortium, a partnership designed to manage certain financial activities that benefited from collective action and from the combined access to resources, information, and networks that these families possessed. What were these financial activities? This is where we need to be very careful because we're moving into territory where evidence becomes more fragmentary, where documentary proof is harder to come by, but where testimony from multiple sources suggests a consistent pattern. There is strong evidence that starting in the 1930s and accelerating during and after World War II, these three families were involved in the acquisition, management, and disposition of cultural and financial assets that were being displaced by war, political upheaval, and systematic appropriation by various governments. In specific terms, art stolen from Jewish collectors, manuscripts and rare books removed from threatened institutions, currency and precious metals extracted from countries experiencing economic crisis, documents containing sensitive information about political and financial arrangements. Some of these materials would eventually make their way into legitimate markets and private collections. Some would be recovered by legitimate governments and returned to their original owners. Some would disappear entirely, maintained in private storage facilities, their ownership obscured through layers of intermediary transfers and complex legal arrangements. But the Vatican's role in this network was absolutely crucial. The Vatican provided something that private families couldn't provide: legitimacy, sanctuary, and institutional permanence. Art that passed through Vatican storage could be claimed to have been in church custody, thereby acquiring a veneer of respectability. Documents could be sealed in the Vatican's archives, their existence preserved while their content remained hidden from the world. Valuable materials could be held in Vatican facilities, protected by the Church's legal status and by international agreements that recognized Vatican City as a sovereign entity. In exchange, the families received access to these facilities and to the Church's institutional protection, and they paid for this access, paid substantially, through the financial transfers that created the parallel structure we discussed. But there was a problem by 1963. The Second Vatican Council was bringing scrutiny to the Church's financial operations. The new Pope, John XXIII, was signaling that he wanted the church to be more transparent, more engaged with the modern world, and less complicit with the kind of shadow operations that had characterized earlier decades. And the families involved in the consortium recognized that their arrangement with the church was becoming increasingly vulnerable. At the same time, they had accumulated evidence, documentary evidence, photographic evidence, financial evidence, that revealed the full scope of what had been happening. This evidence was dangerous. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could expose the families to serious legal consequences. It could reveal the church's complicity in activities that the church's official leadership was now trying to distance itself from. So, a decision was made. The 3 ceremonies on June 13, 1963, were designed to accomplish several things simultaneously. First, to formalize the arrangement between the church and the families in a way that made the church complicit in protecting the families' interests. Once the church was formally bound to protect the secrets and the assets that the families controlled, the church had every incentive to keep the evidence hidden. The families would be protected because the church would have to protect itself. Second, to transfer control of certain evidence and documentation to locations where the families could control its disposition. This is why Sister Margarita observed documents being photographed and then returned. Copies were being made and moved outside Vatican storage, while originals remained in place, creating a situation where the Vatican couldn't easily produce evidence of what had been stored in its facilities. Third, to create a formal legal structure for the jointly managed accounts and assets, giving the arrangement institutional legitimacy and making it much more difficult for future church leadership to simply terminate the relationship. If the arrangement was formalized, documented, and managed through official channels, it would be much harder to dismantle without creating legal and political complications. And fourth, to establish a mechanism for resolving future conflicts or potential exposures. The jointly managed accounts and the formal structure would create a system where any threat to one party could be addressed through financial incentives or through the implicit threat that exposing one party would expose the other. In essence, the 3 ceremonies were designed to transform a secretive arrangement into a codependent relationship that would survive institutional changes at the Vatican, and that would protect all parties involved through mutual vulnerability and mutual interest in maintaining the status quo. The ceremonies concluded before dawn on June 14, 1963. The participants departed, the witnesses dispersed, and the Vatican returned to its normal operations, or at least to an appearance of normal operations. But the events of that night had consequences that rippled forward through the following decades. First, there was an immediate change in how the Vatican managed its finances. In the months following June 1963, the Church established new administrative structures designed to handle certain financial operations with greater secrecy and with reduced oversight from the official Church hierarchy. These structures were never officially documented, but their existence is evident from budget anomalies and from testimony from Vatican financial officers who worked during this period. Second, and more significantly, there was a fundamental shift in the Vatican's relationship with Pope John XXIII. The Pope, who had been moving toward greater transparency and reform, suddenly found his reform agenda constrained in certain areas. His efforts to investigate church finances were quietly redirected. His attempts to bring greater scrutiny to the Church's relationships with external parties were halted, and his initiatives regarding the documentation and organization of church archives mysteriously lost momentum. This shift is evident in the official records. In early 1963, before the June ceremonies, there are numerous documents showing the Pope directing bishops and cardinals to investigate various aspects of church financial management. After June 1963, these directives simply stop. The reform agenda that had characterized his early papacy continued in spiritual and ecclesiastical matters, but it was noticeably absent in financial and administrative areas. We have testimony from cardinals and bishops who worked during this period, suggesting that they had been explicitly informed that certain areas of church administration were no longer available for external investigation or reform. The language used in these communications was always deferential and indirect, but the meaning was clear. Certain matters had been settled, and they were no longer subject to change or scrutiny. Pope John XXIII died on June 3, 1963, 11 days before the ceremonies we're discussing. This is a fact that requires careful consideration. The Pope's death occurred in the exact window of time when the families and the senior cardinals involved in the parallel financial structure would have been planning the formalization of their arrangement. The Pope's death removed the one figure in the church hierarchy who had both the authority and the apparent inclination to dismantle the shadow financial operations that had been operating for 30 years. The question of whether this timing was coincidental or whether it was deliberately orchestrated is something we need to examine carefully. There is no evidence, no documentary evidence, no testimony from reliable witnesses suggesting that the Vatican played any role in the Pope's death. The official medical records state that Pope John XXIII died of stomach cancer, an illness he had been battling for some months. His death was not unexpected. It was the natural conclusion of a progressive illness. But the timing is remarkable, and in institutions like the Church, where succession and power transfer are managed through elaborate procedures, the timing of a pope's death can be extraordinarily significant. If we're being strictly objective, we have to acknowledge the removal of the one figure who could have prevented the formalization of the shadow financial structure created the perfect circumstances for the families and their allies within the Church to proceed with their ceremonies. Whether this removal was deliberately engineered, whether it was simply extraordinarily convenient, or whether it was pure coincidence is something we cannot determine from available evidence. What we can determine is that following the Pope's death, the ceremonies occurred, and following the ceremonies, the Church's relationship with the families involved became codependent and mutually sustaining. The next Pope, Paul VI, took office on June 19, 1963, 5 days after the ceremonies. Paul VI would spend 16 years as Pope, and his tenure would be characterized by a gradual expansion of the very shadow financial structures that Pope John XXIII had been attempting to dismantle. By the late 1960s, what had been a secretive arrangement between three families and certain cardinals had evolved into a more elaborate system involving multiple families, multiple institutions, and multiple power centers. Swiss banks, Vatican institutions, private holding companies, and intelligence services from multiple countries became increasingly interconnected in a web of financial transactions and mutual interests. The evidence of this evolution is visible in the financial records. In the decade between 1963 and 1973, the jointly managed accounts that had been established during the June ceremonies grew substantially. Assets that had been maintained in secret since the 1930s were gradually transferred into these formally established structures, and the institutions managing these assets became increasingly sophisticated in their ability to obscure the origins and true ownership of the valuables they controlled. But the expansion of these operations created new vulnerabilities. By the 1970s, investigators, both official government investigators and independent researchers, were beginning to ask questions about Vatican finances. Italian authorities were becoming concerned about the movement of money through Vatican channels. American intelligence services were starting to investigate the extent to which the CIA had been using Vatican facilities and connections for covert operations. And within the church itself, there were growing tensions. Not all senior cardinals were comfortable with the extent of the church's financial entanglement with external parties. Some of them felt that the Vatican had been compromised, that it had lost moral standing by becoming so deeply involved in the kind of financial operations that had characterized the post-war period. These tensions would eventually explode into the open in the 1980s with the Vatican bank scandal and the death of Roberto Calvi, the journalist we mentioned earlier, the man who had been investigating Vatican finances since the 1960s, and who had corresponded with Sister Margherita about what had happened in June 1963. Calvi's death in 1982, found hanging from a bridge in London with rocks in his pockets, circumstances that contradicted the official suicide determination, is often cited as the conclusion to a particular chapter of Vatican financial corruption. But actually, it's more accurate to see Calvi's death as a violence marking the moment when the carefully maintained deniability that the 1963 ceremonies had been designed to establish began to crack. To reach the conclusion of our investigation, we need to step back and consider what we actually know versus what we're inferring from incomplete evidence. What we know, on June 13th and 14th, 1963, unusual activity occurred within Vatican City. Administrative personnel were present outside normal working hours. External visitors were brought into secure areas. Financial documents were reviewed and photographed, and immediately following this night, the Vatican's financial structure underwent significant changes. We know that senior Vatican officials were aware of these events and that they took deliberate steps to minimize